Hospitals have a peculiar way of distorting your perception at night. The sterile hum of the environment is unsettling enough, but when darkness descends, it transforms into something entirely different. A quiet, echoing void that feels unnaturally empty and eerie. I had been admitted for a minor surgery, nothing serious, but they wanted me under observation for a few days, which was considered routine. My room was situated at the end of a long hallway, isolated from the bustling areas and far from the nurses' station. Initially, it felt tranquil, but as the hours dragged on, that solitude morphed into a sense of abandonment. On my second night, the discomfort began to seep in. I found myself drifting in and out of sleep, caught in that hazy, half-conscious state where sounds appear amplified and shadows grow darker. I heard footsteps in the hallway, which wasn't unusual for a hospital at night, but something felt off about them. They were slow, dragging, with prolonged pauses between each step. I assumed it was a nurse, perhaps checking on patients with the quiet care they use during nighttime rounds, wanting to avoid disturbing anyone. I turned over in bed, attempting to ignore the sounds and return to sleep, but the footsteps halted right outside my door, lingering for a moment. I expected a gentle knock or the soft creak of the door opening, but there was nothing, only silence. The longer I listened, the more unsettling it became. The presence outside my door remained still, not making a sound. I glanced at the clock, 3:07 a.m. Just as I was starting to convince myself I was overthinking things, perhaps imagining it all, I noticed it, a shadow stretching across the narrow beam of light that filtered in from beneath the door. It wasn't a trick of the light. This shadow was clear and distinct, with a form that resembled a human, but it didn't move as a person's shadow should. It simply lingered, motionless, as if someone were standing perfectly still right outside my door, watching me. I sat up in bed, my pulse racing, but still clinging to rational explanations. Maybe it was a nurse on a call. Perhaps they had just stepped away from my door for a moment. But as I stared, the shadow remained unmoving. I strained to listen, trying to catch even the faintest sound, but there was nothing. After a few moments, the shadow receded, as if it were melting back into the darkness. The next morning, I convinced myself it had all been a figment of my imagination. After all, hospitals and medication can distort reality, I reasoned. When the nurse came in to check my vitals, I casually mentioned it, almost laughing it off, but the nurse didn't seem amused. "Oh, you saw a shadow in the hallway?" she asked, her voice tense. Maybe just one of the night staff on rounds. Her response felt rehearsed, forced, and it left an uneasy feeling in my gut. I tried to shake it off and spent the rest of the day in a distracted haze, unable to fully relax. That night, when the lights dimmed, the tension returned. I watched the hallway with weary eyes, dreading the thought of encountering that shadow again. Midnight came and went, and for a while everything was silent. But at 3:02 a.m., I was jolted awake by the same slow, dragging footsteps. I lay still, my body tensing as I listened. The footsteps stopped outside my door again, and I braced myself for what I knew I would see. Sure enough, the shadow reemerged, but this time it appeared to be pressing itself against the crack beneath the door. The air felt thick. I stared at the shadow, unable to look away, wondering who or what was standing there and why it wasn't entering or moving away. Suddenly the shadow shifted, as if whatever it was had changed its position, and then just as quickly, it faded into the darkness again, leaving the hallway eerily silent. The following morning, I noticed the patient across the hall, an older man named Mr. Wilkes, conversing with a nurse. I couldn't catch most of their discussion, but one phrase caught my attention, making my heart skip a beat. The shadow in the hallway. He had seen it too. I realized it wasn't my imagination. Something was truly lurking in the hallway at night, something that only revealed itself in the dead hours when everyone else was asleep. A chill settled over me as I glanced back at my door, dreading the thought of spending another night in that room. When the nurse came in to check on me, I mentioned what Mr. Wilkes had said, hoping she might provide some rational explanation. But her expression changed, and she quickly dismissed it, saying Mr. Wilkes was on heavy medication and often hallucinated. Yet, the way she avoided my gaze made me suspect there was more to it, something she didn't want to discuss. That night, I tried to keep myself awake, determined to confront the shadow if it returned. I kept my bedside light on, hoping it would be enough to ward off whatever it was. Hours passed, and I eventually succumbed to exhaustion, drifting off despite my fear. But at precisely 3 a.m., I was jolted awake. The room was silent, yet the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as if I were being watched. I turned my head toward the door, my heart racing, and there it was again, the shadow, darker and more defined than ever before, pressed against the narrow opening of my door, which was slightly ajar. It seemed eager, almost as if it were trying to get in. I couldn't tear my eyes away, watching with morbid fascination as it began to move slowly, gliding down the hallway, only to pause at Mr. Wilkes' door. The shadow lingered there for a long moment, and then, to my horror, it passed through his closed door, disappearing into his room. I lay there, too terrified to move, straining to listen for any sign of what was occurring across the hall, but there was nothing. Only an oppressive silence that felt suffocating. I barely slept for the rest of the night, my mind racing with fear and questions. In the morning, I learned that Mr. Wilkes had passed away during the night. The nurses claimed he had gone peacefully, that it was simply his time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow had something to do with it. I knew what I'd seen, and I was convinced it wasn't a coincidence. Later that day, I overheard two nurses conversing in hushed tones outside my room. "It's always around 3 in the morning," one of them whispered, "and it's always the patients at the end of the hall. I don't know what it is, but it's not natural." Hearing that sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just a trick of the light or a side effect of medication. Something was in the hospital, something that only emerged in the dead of night, and I was next in line. That night, I lay awake, my body tense with fear. I knew it would come for me, just as it had come for Mr. Wilkes. I watched the clock, my heart pounding harder as the minutes crept closer to 3 a.m. I wanted to escape, to run out of that room and never look back, but I was too terrified to move. When the clock struck 3 a.m., the shadow appeared again, darker and more defined than ever. It slid across the hallway floor, creeping toward my door, and I understood there was no escaping it. I held my breath, watching as the shadow pressed against the narrow gap of my door, almost as if it were testing the barrier, searching for a way in. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, filling the room with a sense of dread so intense it was overwhelming. For what felt like hours, the shadow lingered outside my door, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The following morning, I was discharged from the hospital. I left as quickly as I could, relieved to be free of that place. But even now, I can't shake the memory of that shadow lurking in the hallway, waiting, and sometimes I wonder if it's still there, waiting for its next victim. Hospitals hold countless secrets, and after years as a doctor, I was well acquainted with the strange stories shared in hushed tones at the nurse's station or over a quick coffee during night shifts. I never imagined I'd become part of one. It was a typical night on the medical floor, where I was working the night shift. Things were slow, with only a few patients in critical care. I'd been through plenty of quiet nights, and when things were calm, I usually appreciated it. As I headed to check on one of my patients, Mr. Peterson, an elderly man who'd been in a coma for nearly 2 weeks, I felt an inexplicable tension. Mr. Peterson was stable, yet his chances of recovery were slim. His family had already said their goodbyes, and the staff had prepared for the inevitable. Earlier that evening, I had checked his vitals, and everything seemed normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was somehow different. Approaching his room, I noticed something unusual. The soft hum of the monitors filled the air as usual, but the sounds seemed to carry an odd undertone, a faint murmur drifting down the hall. I slowed my pace, straining to pick up any words, but the noise vanished as soon as I stopped. I brushed it off as a trick of the mind and continued to Mr. Peterson's room, mentally reviewing his chart to keep my thoughts focused. Quietly opening the door, I stepped inside, only to find Mr. Peterson awake. He lay there, staring up at the ceiling, his face unreadable, his eyes dull and glassy from his prolonged coma, now seemed to hold a spark, a flicker of awareness. It was startling to see him awake after all this time. "Mr. Peterson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Slowly he turned his head to look at me, and for a moment I wasn't sure he recognized me. Then, as if a moment of clarity washed over him, he gave the faintest nod. "Doctor," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's leaving us tonight." "Who's leaving, Mr. Peterson?" I asked, puzzled. He looked past me, focusing his gaze on something just over my shoulder. I resisted the urge to turn around as a chill ran down my spine. His face was calm, almost peaceful, as though he was confiding in me. "She's waiting," he murmured, his eyes drifting back to the ceiling. I wasn't sure how to respond. I'd seen patients experience confusion or hallucinations when coming out of a coma, but this felt different. His tone, his certainty, it felt as though he was making a statement rather than drifting through a delusion. I managed to regain my composure, making a note in his chart, but his words continued to echo in my mind. "She's leaving us tonight." I checked his vitals and administered his medication, doing my best to ignore the lingering feeling that something was amiss. As I turned to leave, Mr. Peterson whispered again, his voice soft as a breeze, "She's here." I looked back at him. His eyes were locked on the door, wide and unblinking. I followed his gaze, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the doorway was empty. "Who's here, Mr. Peterson?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. He didn't reply. His eyes remained fixed on the door. I took a step closer, hoping to bring him back to reality, but his expression stayed unchanged. It was as though he was staring into the empty hallway, seeing something just beyond the threshold. Unease growing in my stomach, I left the room, casting a final glance back at him before closing the door. His words lingered in my mind as I walked down the hall. Back at the nurse's station, I found Linda, the head nurse, preparing charts for the next shift. I tried to shake off the tension, but I couldn't resist sharing what I had just experienced. "Linda," I said, trying to sound casual, "do you know much about Mr. Peterson? Has he ever been lucid before?" She looked at me, frowning slightly. "No, he's been unresponsive since he was admitted." "Why?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound dramatic. "He was awake just now, and he said something strange." Her expression shifted, a mix of curiosity and unease. "Strange how?" "He told me someone was leaving us tonight," I replied. Then he said, "She's here," and kept looking at the door as if he was seeing someone standing there. Linda's face paled slightly, and she glanced down the hall toward Mr. Peterson's room. "You're not the first to mention that," she said. I leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "There are rumors among the night staff," she replied. "Sometimes patients close to the end say similar things. It's like they sense something the rest of us can't. They say they see someone waiting for them." A chill settled over me. I'd heard stories of patients having visions, but I'd always dismissed them as hallucinations or effects of medication. But there was a weight to her words that made it hard to dismiss. "Has anyone else on this floor mentioned it recently?" I asked. Linda looked down the hall again, her expression unreadable. "Room 217. The woman in there passed away last night. She told one of the nurses someone had come to visit her, but when they checked, the hallway was empty." A shiver ran through me. I hadn't been on duty the night before, but the thought of another patient seeing the same thing left me unsettled. Could it really be just a coincidence? Trying to shake off the discomfort, I resumed my rounds, checking on other patients. But as the hours passed, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Each time I passed an empty room or a shadowy corner, I felt an invisible presence, as if someone lingered just out of sight. Returning to the nurse's station, I heard a soft beep from one of the monitors down the hall. I checked my watch, 3:12 a.m. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving only a skeleton crew to cover the floor. The corridor stretched ahead, silent and dimly lit, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. I made my way back to Mr. Peterson's room, feeling compelled to check on him again. After his strange words earlier, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual was unfolding. Entering the room, I was met with an unexpected sight. Mr. Peterson was awake, not groggy or confused, but fully alert, with a spark of awareness in his eyes for the first time since he'd been admitted. A nurse was by his bedside, calmly adjusting his pillows and checking his IVs. He looked over at me with a faint smile. "Mr. Peterson, you're awake," I stammered, doing my best to hide my shock. He seemed completely at ease, as if he had simply woken from a restful sleep, has not a weeks-long coma. "Awake and feeling pretty good, Doc," he said with a chuckle. "The nurses here know how to take care of you." I looked at the nurse, who nodded, confirming that everything had been checked and adjusted as usual. For her, it was routine, but to me, the situation felt anything but ordinary. "How are you feeling, Mr. Peterson?" I asked, still taken aback. "Honestly, like I've been asleep forever," he replied. "But everything feels normal, like I'm just waking up." He paused, noticing the expression on my face. "Is something wrong?" It took me a second to respond. "Not at all. I'm just glad to see you awake. But do you remember anything from earlier tonight?" Mr. Peterson's brow furrowed. "Earlier tonight? I don't remember anything." "Why?" I hesitated, then pressed on. "You said something about someone leaving us tonight. Does that ring any bells?" He shook his head, looking genuinely puzzled. "Doc, I don't remember saying anything like that. I told myself he might have been drifting in and out of consciousness, saying things he couldn't recall now." Yet, the memory of his voice, so clear and certain, kept replaying in my mind. The rest of the night passed without incident. A few hours later, I came by Mr. Peterson's room again. He was asleep, looking as peaceful as anyone just emerging from weeks of unconsciousness could be. Around 5 in the morning, a nurse from the ICU paged me. A patient had passed away in the early hours. It was a woman in her late 40s who had been battling a series of complex health issues for months. Scanning her chart, I couldn't help but glance down the hall toward Mr. Peterson's room, just one door away from where the woman had passed. The realization struck me hard. She's leaving us tonight. Had Mr. Peterson somehow sensed what was about to happen next door? After her passing, a peculiar stillness settled over the hallway, a quiet that lingered even as the hospital awoke with the morning routines of doctors, nurses, and patients. It was a heaviness I couldn't quite explain, as though something profound had happened in those silent hours, something beyond human understanding. I never brought up the incident with Mr. Peterson again, and neither did he. When he was discharged a few days later, he was as clear-headed as anyone, never mentioning the strange events of that night. But whenever I walk past that room, I remember his words and wonder if some things in life or in death simply lie beyond explanation. I've spent years working as a night nurse, and over time, you witness so much that you start to become accustomed to it. Eventually, you even get used to being accustomed, if that makes sense. Yet, every now and then, something happens that leaves a lasting impression on you. I wouldn't call myself superstitious, or at least I didn't used to be, but there's one night that continues to haunt me, as if it happened just yesterday. It was a calm night shift when I had an older gentleman, Mr. Connor, in room 216. He had been admitted after suffering a major stroke, and when he arrived, he was already in a coma. The doctors were blunt. They told us he probably wouldn't wake up. In truth, he was just there, breathing, but barely alive. Many would say he was existing rather than truly living. Most nights I would check in on him to monitor his vitals, ensure his IV was functioning, and maybe adjust his blankets. He became a familiar part of my routine, and I grew accustomed to the faint, steady sound of his breathing, which became woven into the fabric of my shift. But there was something unsettling about him, or perhaps his room. I can't quite pinpoint it, but there was a strange sensation that washed over me whenever I entered. It's hard to articulate, but at times it felt as if there was a weight in the air, a heaviness pressing down on me the moment I crossed the threshold. One night, probably around 2 a.m., I was making my usual rounds. The hallways were deserted and completely silent, and I noticed it felt colder than normal. Hospitals are always chilly, but that night it felt absolutely frigid. I was bundled up in my sweater, yet it didn't help. My hands were shaking from the cold as I approached room 216. When I entered Mr. Connor's room, the cold hit me even harder, as if I had stepped into a freezer. I shivered, pulled my sweater tighter, and convinced myself it was just the air conditioning. I tried to focus on my responsibilities, checking his vitals and monitoring the machines, but I couldn't shake this unsettling feeling creeping up the back of my neck. You know that sensation when you feel like someone's watching you? That's exactly what I was experiencing. I attempted to brush it off. I didn't want to let my imagination get the best of me in the middle of my shift. As I leaned over Mr. Connor to check his IV, I noticed something alarming. His breathing was so faint, so light, that I had to lean in closer to confirm my observation. And then, out of nowhere, he moved. I swear my heart nearly stopped. One moment he was lying there, completely still, and the next he sat up, staring directly at me. It wasn't a slow movement. It was as if he had suddenly come to life. His eyes were wide open, fixed right on mine. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. I felt like I was looking at a ghost. Then he spoke. "He's coming for me," he whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. Those words hung in the air, heavy and chilling. I tried to ask him what he meant, to inquire about who he was referring to, but before I could utter a sound, his eyes shut and he collapsed back onto the bed. Just like that, he was gone again, and his breathing returned to its slow, shallow rhythm as if he hadn't stirred at all. I stood there, frozen, attempting to process what I had just witnessed. My thoughts raced, and a wave of fear and confusion washed over me. I convinced myself it must have been some kind of reflex, perhaps a final burst of energy. People say that can happen, but I couldn't shake his words from my mind. "He's coming for me." The way he had said it, with such certainty, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Feeling tightness in my chest, I left the room and walked back to the nurse's station, hoping my colleagues wouldn't notice how shaken I was. But I must have looked pale, because one of them asked if I was all right. I nodded, trying to laugh it off, claiming it was just the cold or fatigue. The truth was, I couldn't stop replaying it all in my mind. After a few minutes, I forced myself to return and check on him again. I told myself I was being absurd, that it was merely a bizarre moment I needed to let go of. However, when I opened the door to his room, his bed was empty. My first thought was that perhaps he had been moved for some late-night testing, though deep down I knew that was unlikely. The sheets were still warm, as if he had just been there moments ago. I dashed back to the nurse's station, striving to maintain my composure as I asked, "Did someone move Mr. Connor?" They looked at me, puzzled. "Move him? What are you talking about?" one asked, confusion evident in her eyes. "Mr. Connor is gone," I insisted, trying to remain calm, though panic surged inside me. They all stared at me like I was losing my mind. We began searching the floor, checking every room, even the supply closets and stairwells, but he was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had just vanished into thin air. The more we searched, the more I felt that same chilling sensation enveloping me, a cold that penetrated to my bones. I kept hearing his words echoing in my mind, "He's coming for me." Eventually, one of the nurses suggested we review the security footage. We gathered around the monitor, all of us tense as the security guard rewound the tape from that night. Then we saw it. There was Mr. Connor lying in his bed just as I had left him. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the door. A tall man dressed in dark clothing slipped into the room, moving with such grace it was almost as if he were gliding. He approached the bed without hesitation, reached down and lifted Mr. Connor into a wheelchair he had brought with him. There was something unsettling about how he moved. Too practiced, too calm. We watched as he wheeled Mr. Connor out of the room, down the empty corridor, and out of sight. Not a single person noticed him. He didn't pass a single nurse or trigger an alarm. It was as if he had orchestrated the entire thing, down to the last detail. The police were notified immediately, and they interrogated all of us, trying to piece together how someone could walk in and take a patient without anyone noticing. But none of us had any answers. We were just as shocked as they were. The footage showed everything, yet there was no trace of them after they exited the building. For days, there was no news, no sign of Mr. Connor or the man who had taken him. The police kept investigating, constantly contacting us with more questions, but it was as if they had simply vanished. I couldn't stop thinking about what Mr. Connor had said. Those words lingered in my mind. "He's coming for me." It felt like a warning, as if he had foreseen this outcome. Finally, about a week later, the police located them. They identified the man in the footage as Mr. Connor's son. It turned out that Mr. Connor had made his son promise years ago that he wouldn't allow him to die in a hospital. He had always harbored a fear of hospitals, like many who view them as places where people go to die. It was a pact they had made, and his son had returned to fulfill that promise. They found both of them in an old farmhouse a few towns away. Mr. Connor was weak, barely able to sit up, yet he refused to return to the hospital. He passed away 2 weeks later with his son by his side, just as he had wished. As tragic as the story was, I couldn't shake the memory of him sitting up in that hospital bed, looking straight at me and saying, "He's coming for me." It felt as if he had known all along. Doing hospital security on the night shift is already unsettling. Throw in strange events, and it gets intense. I took the job, figuring it would be simple. Keep the halls secure, do a few rounds each shift, and generally make sure no one was sneaking into the hospital. But the reality turned out to be something I hadn't expected. There's an eerie quality to hospitals at night, an intense stillness that hangs in the air. I told myself that it was all just my mind playing tricks, that the constant hum of the air conditioning or the buzzing lights in the stairwell were normal. After all, any building this old would have its quirks. I was getting paid to stand watch and ignore those minor disturbances. That was until one particular shift down near the morgue. I had never enjoyed being near the morgue, if I'm honest. I tried to avoid it as much as possible. But that Wednesday night, I was assigned to the basement level, meaning that every hour I'd have to do a sweep of the area, checking locks, doors, and making sure all was secure. The hospital was emptier than usual that night, with few patients and even fewer visitors. Just a couple of staff members wandering the halls on different floors, trying to wrap up their shifts. At around 11 p.m., the basement was cold, unusually so. Hospitals are always chilly, but this had a different feel, a bone-chilling cold that made you feel as if you were walking straight into a freezer. Then, I noticed a faint flicker of light at the end of the hallway leading to the morgue. Figuring it was probably just another faulty bulb, I didn't think much of it at first. Still, I added it to my list of issues to report. As I approached the morgue entrance, the lights seemed to flicker again, this time pulsing as though they were synced with my footsteps. I forced myself to keep calm, pushing the unsettling feeling away. Flickering lights happen. The morgue is just a room. My thoughts kept spiraling like this, attempting to keep things normal. I was just doing my job. But then, as I walked past the main door, I thought I heard something. A faint, indistinct noise that I couldn't quite make out. It was almost like someone whispering. I stopped to listen, but all I heard was the humming of the air vents, so I kept moving, mentally telling myself to keep it together. Just as I took a few steps forward, I heard it again, clearer this time, a voice low and weak, whispering, "Derek." I froze. I told myself it had to be my mind playing tricks. Perhaps it was just the wind moving through the ventilation system or a distant echo of a conversation from another floor. But it hadn't sounded like that. It sounded personal. Whoever it was, they'd said my name. I shook it off, or tried to. The hospital was just a big empty building at night, after all. It's easy to imagine things. But the voice came again, and this time it was so clear, so unmistakable, that I couldn't ignore it. Derek. I took a deep breath, reasoning with myself. I was the security guard. I had to check it out, make sure no one was breaking any rules, no one was trespassing or doing anything they shouldn't. Slowly, I made my way to the morgue door and pulled it open just a bit more. The light inside was dim, but it illuminated the room well enough for me to see that it was, in fact, empty. But as I turned to leave, that voice came again, louder, closer. "Derek, please." My breath caught in my throat. This time it was unmistakable. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was calling my name, pleading against every instinct, screaming at me to leave. I walked further into the room, scanning the shadows, my heart racing as I took in every corner, every surface. Nothing was out of place. The tables were empty, the drawers were shut, and the silence was as thick as the walls around me. But as I stood there, I heard something else, a faint rhythmic tapping. The sound was soft, but it echoed through the room, steady and constant, almost like fingers tapping against the metal drawers. I turned my flashlight toward the source of the sound, my hands trembling as I gripped it tightly, expecting to see something, anything, but again there was nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn around and leave, I felt something cold, an intense chill, pressing against the back of my neck. It was as if someone had exhaled an icy breath against my skin. I spun around, my flashlight scanning the room frantically, but again, nothing. I was alone, or at least I should have been. As I stood there trying to steady my breathing, the tapping started again, coming from the far end of the room. My heart raced, every fiber of my being screaming at me to get out, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear myself away. It felt like something was holding me there, like I was meant to hear, to listen, to understand. The room fell silent. I was already on edge, and that silence made everything feel even more intense. I turned to leave when I heard a faint shuffle somewhere down the hall, growing louder, like someone slowly making their way down the corridor. My first instinct was to brush it off as a janitor or another night shift employee, but something about those footsteps felt wrong. They were slow, almost hesitant, yet steady, each one drawing closer to the morgue. They echoed off the tiled walls, bouncing around me, making it impossible to tell exactly where they were coming from. Then I realized the footsteps were heading straight toward me. I strained to hear, hoping maybe they'd turn, fade off in another direction. But they didn't. They kept moving closer. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I grabbed my flashlight and backed toward the exit, my heart hammering as I reached for the doorknob. The footsteps were only a few feet away now, right outside the door. I barely twisted the knob before I yanked it open and darted into the hallway. Once in the hall, I didn't look back. I kept moving fast, not stopping until I was out of that corridor and back near the safety of the main floor. Only when I reached the light and heard the familiar sounds of the hospital's night routine did I pause, catching my breath. That night, I realized there was more in the silence of the hospital than I'd ever imagined, and whatever was down there in the morgue, I didn't intend to find out. When I finally calmed down, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen and heard. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, the stress of the night shift getting to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I hadn't imagined the voice, the chill. Something or someone had been in that morgue with me, reaching out, desperate, trapped. After that night, I avoided the morgue as much as possible, requesting shifts that kept me away from the basement. But every now and then, I'd hear stories from other guards, tales of whispers, strange noises, lights flickering at odd times. Each time, I'd feel that familiar chill, the memory of that voice calling my name. The last time I was assigned to the basement, I did my rounds quickly, keeping my head down, my footsteps light, not daring to linger. I don't know what was in that morgue that night. Maybe it was a lost soul, a spirit trapped between worlds, reaching out for someone to hear its plea. Or maybe it was just the building, the echoes of lives and deaths that had passed through its walls, lingering, hoping for someone to remember. All I know is that, since that night, I've never set foot in that morgue again, and every time I pass by, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching, waiting, hoping for another chance to whisper my name. If these stories kept you on edge, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more unsettling encounters. Turn on notifications so you won't miss what's coming next. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes it's what you don't see in the hospital that's the most frightening. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.